You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're talking about the 1982 3D horror movie, Rottweiler, aka Dogs of Hell. Here we go. All right, so I got notes on Rottweiler for a movie that starred the 10 of the deadliest dogs in the world. Once you live this movie, you'll never forget the name Rottweiler. A freakish army experiment out of control terrorizes resort town. They were perfectly trained for one task. You know what that task was, Pete? Manslaughter. There's also probably a place to talk about Rottweiler's place in the animals amok, animal creature feature category, because I feel like definitely in that group picture, and Earl Owensby was someone that popped up on our radar now. You're going to hear about it because you're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. Pete Charbonneau, co-host extraordinaire, also on. And we're talking about Rottweiler, a.k.a. Dogs of War 3D.
Dogs of Hell.
Dogs of Hell. Thank you. Let's get this started on the right foot, or right paw, as they might say.
Rottweiler is a terrifying experience.
It's just too dangerous to continue.
Nonsense, Mr. Fletcher.
For security reasons, we decided to use a civilian transport. No sense advertising.
Isn't this just a little extreme, just to transport a bunch of dogs?
Rottweilers, sir. The breed supposedly dates back to the time of Christ.
That's a curious remark. If I'm to believe Fletcher's report on the destructive capability of these creatures...
You can believe it, sir. Any mistakes in the operation would be critical.
You've got the authority to stop this thing.
That's true, Mr. Fletcher. A secret military project goes out of control when a truck loaded with nightmares releases its deadly cargo. Rottweiler.
If you are a regular listener to the Fan2Fan Podcast, you will note that Pete and I have taken on the responsibility, the burden on our shoulders to talk about 3D movies that no one else will talk about.
Yeah, I don't know if you can call it responsibility if no one else wanted to pick up the mantle.
Fair.
But we did it anyway because someone had to do it. I feel like there's so few niches out there that one can call their own. After we get through these last few 80s 3D movies, the phone figuratively and literally will be ringing off the hook with people asking our expert opinions on this little genre slice of cinema.
And we've developed an expertise because we took the road less traveled. We haven't talked about Friday the 13th Part 3, Jaws 3D, Amityville 3D. You would think that's where we would start. Yet. It's a good point, Pete. Yet. But we have talked about Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared-Sin, Space Hunter, Adventures of the Forbidden Zone, Piranha 3D, Treasure of the Four Crowns with Canon Films guide extraordinaire Austin Trunick. So much so, it broke up into 2 episodes. So check those out if you have any interest in Canon Films, 3D films, and a Raiders of the Lost Ark ripoff that was made in the 80s. Pete and I had the privilege of talking about Coming at You, the first and maybe only 3D Western that we realize kind of set the pace for the 80s 3D trend that we grew up with. And the movie that we're talking about now, Rottweiler, have you heard of this movie, Pete, before we went down the 3D rabbit hole?
No.
Okay.
No, definitely not. And I think one of the interesting things for me, now that we've been on this journey for well over a month now, I knew the heavy hitters. And if anyone's listened to any of the previous episodes on Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared-Sin, Space Hunter, you would know that I was actually in the theater for both of those movies. And to know that Amityville 3D, Friday the 13th Part 3, Jaws 3D, those are like the heavy hitters of like this genre. So knowing that those were out there and be like, oh, we're going to go back and cover these, I'm ready. Maybe not so much for Amityville 3D, we'll see. But I'm ready to dive into this. But then when you started doing like the deeper dive and discovering like Pete, have you ever heard of Coming at You? I'm like, what? What are you talking like? A what? 80s Western 3D? What? Who's this Tony Anthony character? And then as we've gone into this, it's like, oh, this is interesting. There's just when you think that you've like dug as deep as you can go, there's always that one extra film that's just waiting to be discovered, at least by us. That film that we'll be discussing today is Rottweiler, a.k.a. Dogs of Hell, not to be confused with Devil Dog, Hound of Hell, which was
That's right.
1970s TV movie that scared the shit out of me when I was a kid. And you would think, like, TV movie, what could really be so scary about it? But when you're 12, 13 years old and you're watching the kid from, I think both the kids from Escape to Witch Mountain, and this, adorable German Shepherd that was infused with, I believe, Satan himself in some satanic ritual. Yeah, in the midst of the satanic panic of the 70s.
Yes, that's right.
You too may shit your pants if you go. So.
That's very true. The best thing about these 3D movies, Pete, they are the gift that keeps on giving. Rottweiler certainly being one of them. I think before we get into the movie, I do want to go down the animal creature feature lane with you, because we both have an affinity for a certain movie. But before we get to that one, when I think of this genre, I don't necessarily think of dogs or cats. Like, I think of sharks, apes, bugs, like giant lizards, like those really cheesy movies from the 50s with the atomic age, the mutation, like man has gone too far and nature is getting its revenge. All those big
giant mantis, and then
Earth versus a spider, like all of those kind of movies. But when you get kind of past that category, the movie that I think we both really like is The Birds.
Oh, might be my favorite Hitchcock film of all time. Seeing it when I did at the age that I did, it just left an incredible, indelible mark on me. How could it not? I mean, even if you're an adult watching it, I think it's an excellent film. Funny enough, I just rewatched it again.
Okay.
I always have to go back and just, give a rewatch. There's a comfort to watching it that brings me back to a place in my younger years that I just love. So fast forward out of the 50s and you get into the 70s where it becomes like a little more ecological, still some nuclear stuff, but you get into those Burt I. Gordon films like Food of the Gods, Empire of the Ants, just like some 70s cheese where, again, like you're still talking like giant animals.
Yes.
I'm not sure. Other than like there was like Day of the Animals in the 70s, but Leslie Nielsen is in it, where nature just decides to, similar to the birds. Like I don't think an explanation is given. Just nature,
but not exclusive to the birds. It's every creature, great and small.
Every creature. Yeah. Nature is just kind of like, we're fed up with humans and we're just going to revolt and attack and kill everyone.
And I don't remember that one, but I remember Night of the Lepus, because I've seen that on Svengoolie a few times, and some of the special effects work on that one. The mileage varies a little bit on almost all of these movies. Certainly like Jaws in 75 was like the big stake in the ground that I think before, like we had Willard, frogs and stuff like that. But then I think Jaws gets into that like nature run amok. Then Jaws becomes literally a big splash. And then you get like the Grizzly, the Kingdom of the Spiders, Orca, Piranha, Alligator, where it becomes still exotic creatures. That's why I think Rottweiler is so interesting, because it's still in that other category of a creature you would have in your house that would turn against you, which in some ways you think of Jaws, then just don't go in the ocean, or like Orca or Alligator or like Razorback. It's like, well, just don't go into the Australian outback and you'll be okay, versus something like Rottweiler that feels a little different than some of those other flicks.
For sure. And I don't remember if this, I want to say that it was kind of a thing, but before, like, pit bulls were like the breed of choice to like,
there you go,
of all like the, some of it warranted, some of it, just maybe sensationalized, or like attacks on children and things like that. I feel like Rottweilers, and maybe before that, like Dobermans were like the scary guard dog equivalent of like, oh, well, if you're going to the used car lot, after hours, there's a giant Doberman, or perhaps a brother-sister combo of Rottweilers hanging out to guard the place. So I feel like this movie was capitalizing on some of that stigma of this.
No, that's a good point, especially when I think of movies like Remo Williams, and there's a scene where he's like breaking into a military facility, and these trained Dobermans are like walking on wires going after him, and it's all meant to be a bit of a joke. But it's the Doberman who's the guard dog, who is vicious, who's slobbering, just like the Rottweiler. So I think that's dead on what you said, like the stigma of those dogs then becomes what you said, like Devil Dog and Cujo. And I think I found like a few of The Man's Best Friend, White Dog, those killer dog movies of the 70s into the 80s that all lean into this perception.
Right.
Because if the devil's going to possess any dog, it would be one of those breeds. That really is what brings us Rottweiler, aka dogs of hell. That's what brings us here. And I think for folks that are not familiar with this movie, I think there's a case where like this movie is as much a product of that trend of nature, animals run amok, getting revenge, as much as it is the Venn diagram of the 3D gimmick as well. Because that's where it's kind of in the two categories.
And throw in a little bit of like the secret military experiment.
Oh, good call.
Angle,
yes.
Because like these dogs, as we find out, well, actually pretty much right from the beginning, they've been trained and modified in some way it's kind of explained. And it's kind of like thrown away later in the film, but like these are like special. This is like a special breed of Rottweilers that the government and the military are, for some reason, deciding to just put in the hands of one semi-truck driver to drive across.
That's right.
Who, really needed to up his semi-truck license, driving skills, because taking those S curves really recklessly, and it does not end well for him. But I guess if he's not so incompetent, we don't have a movie. So
if this movie has taught us anything, is that sometimes you just don't go with the contract with the lowest bid, because it doesn't always work out well for you.
Dogs of Hell. Earl Owensby is Hank Will, a tough sheriff who sets out to save the town from those jaws with paws.
All right. Well, before we get into the movie, I just got to ask you the question point blank. Did you like this movie, Pete?
It's a great question, Bernie. Far be it from me to straddle like an electrified fence that would keep, a canine from getting loose. I started off not liking this movie at all.
Okay.
But as I kept watching it, I won't say that it got better, but I got more interested in one, its existence, and two, what it was trying to do. So I didn't hate it.
Okay.
It's not a good movie.
Would it be fair to say that you went in maybe not expecting to like it either?
I went in with about as blank a slate as I could for this, because I'm like, all right, I'm not a huge fan. I mean, Jaws and those movies aside, but something where you take regular dogs like this and they're like on the loose, and going in not knowing that this was like some genetic or training experiment thing gone awry. I'm just like, I don't know if I can get behind just like a pack of Rottweilers going around attacking.
I think
people.
There's like a 70s movie that's actually called The Pack, which is exactly the plot that you just described.
Well, I'll be avoiding that.
FYI.
But no, again, I was fascinated with just the low budget, the down and dirty filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
Like it owes so much to Jaws on so many levels. It's like, you've got like this natural menace is let loose in a community. This one being like a mountain lakeside community. You've got the sheriff doing a lot of driving around town
in his like burnt orange pickup truck,
with
suited
like the roll bar.
Exactly.
That reminded me of what like Chief Brody was driving around in Jaws as well.
There you go.
But,
yes,
different color, but I'm just kind of like, okay. And you got like the aw shucks, like local sheriff. And, then, of course, when you get the military part, there's like the guy that trained these dogs that shows up and
that's right,
wants them unharmed because he feels like he can still control them. And, at that point, the dogs have killed, enough people both on and off screen that, the townspeople who, of course, have to go out on the big townspeople, like, we're going to go into the woods and find these dogs and kill them again.
That's
like,
right.
a lot of echoes of Jaws in this movie. So maybe a bit of Piranha too,
for sure,
just like that gritty feel to it. So it's an interesting movie. I think the acting brings it down, but then at the same time, the acting gets into the so bad it's good category, and we'll discuss some of these actors / characters. It's an odd one. It's an odd one. I don't know if it gets quite into the so bad it's good category, but it definitely flirts with it. And there are some points where I'm just like, okay, I think it goes on a bit too long. There was one point where there's a scene that the dogs have they've attacked like a campsite, and these two women run into an abandoned house, and then the government official guy is in there as well with them. And you're like, okay, this is kind of interesting, because this is setting up to be almost like an interesting climax where like the dog got like the house, like this abandoned house surrounded, and what's going to happen. The sheriff's out somewhere in the woods, like hunting them. And then the scene ends, and I check the time, and there's still like 40 minutes left in the movie. I'm like, holy shit.
There were at least 2 times where I was wondering, I'm like, what else is there to do? Like, what else is happening in this movie?
It's only like an hour and a half movie, but it feels a lot longer.
Yes.
And I think that's why I can't like wholeheartedly recommend it, because there's a lot of stuff that just drags in it. A lot of driving. I feel like half the dialogue in this movie is literally the sheriff greeting or being greeted by other people in town.
100%. Yes. In some ways, like that first scene you mentioned, where it becomes a little bit of exposition city, where they tell us this is a military operation and they've created these dogs to be a weapon. It's like that first 10-minute scene is giving us something that could easily be done in about 2 minutes. But I think this is them kind of taking advantage that, this is how we get an hour and a half running time. So that's how we beef it up a little bit. After that, it's the sheriff going to the sheriff's station to meet his presumed deputy who's typing away, to basically throw a few darts in full 3D fashion, to then just leave the station a minute later. Like there's nothing there. It's not like he gets the report that maybe out in the outskirts of the Pines, this like beach resort community, someone was killed. It's literally, he shows up. He's like, hey, you want to play darts, Jim? No, I'm good. All right.
Yeah, there's really no character building there. Like you just introduced to him. I think the deputy gets a phone call and he's like, "It's so and so. You want to talk to him?" He's like, "No, I don't." And then he just I'm going to go on patrol.
Yeah, to do exactly what you said, to go now to a bar to introduce us to more people. That I get it. There should be a meter. Victim. I get it. Like everyone you're introducing us to is going to end up probably becoming a victim to this pack of military trained Rottweilers. But man, by the time it started to really get into it, I was like, wow, like this movie could have probably been a lot shorter, because it's not that I didn't enjoy it. I actually, like you, felt the same way. I grew to enjoy it as it was getting towards the end. But I was like, man, I wanted it to get full speed a little faster, because I think that's what gives these movies a little bit more of like a cult classic status, is when they kind of are more aware and they're like, we get it. Like, this is what we are. So maybe let's start getting into kill mode in the first 10, 15 minutes, because we may not have your attention or the production value to do this for an hour and a half. Yeah. I think that's, as we certainly will get into Earl Owensby, who produced this with a lot of other films. This was, just the limitations of what they could do for a movie that would have just been another VHS on the shelf that, supplied the demand of all the mom and pops in the 80s. He was providing some of that supply. We just didn't rent this movie.
Yeah. So I got a question for you. Did you look up anything about the plot of this before you started watching? Did you go in not knowing?
It's almost like you, blank canvas. As Google image search was the most I had. But even then, there's not sometimes when we look up at these movies, because they have international licensing, you start seeing variations of these posters, some more interesting than others. And some of them are, you could tell by looking at a poster, like you see Treasure of Four Crowns. That thing is just like a collage of all of the scenes. So you kind of get a sense that there's a temple and maybe there's lasers and something's going on. And the movie it delivers on all of those, but it's not as promising as you would think.
The way that you hope.
Yeah. This one is so, there's a picture of a dog that's like a painted picture with flames in the back that looks like it would be the cover to a paperback you'd find in the airport. So it doesn't give you much. The military training, especially the weapon, nothing there. So I went in there blank and then saw the movie and then had to go back and realize, okay, now if we're going to talk about this for an hour or so, we're going to have to do some digging to find out a little bit more about this film, which I did. I don't know if it's interesting, but I did find a few things. Let me throw a few at you just to kind of get this going. All right. So the idea for the film grew out of a conversation with Earl Owensby, who we will definitely talk more about.
Star of the film.
Star of the film, absolutely. Producer, star.
His character's name, but he's the sheriff.
Yes, big fingerprints all over this film and a lot of others. He owned 2 Rottweilers, and along with the trainer that he employed, the trainer pitched the premise of a pack of escaped Rottweilers with Owensby as the hero. When I read that, I thought, of course you pitch an idea to the guy who employs you, who has the ability to make movies, to make your idea of a movie starring the guy who gives you money. So that made all the sense in the world. I was like, I get it. And then realizing that Owensby starts looking into 3D films after he sees the release of, this is where all the dots connect, Pete, Coming at You. And he actually purchases lens from some place called Stereo Vision International. And that's when we get like this, all right, well, now I can take advantage of this trend that might make me more money. Which again, for when you start getting past the heavy hitters, this is in the group picture, but man, it is way in the back because not a movie that was on either of our radars. And when we start getting into talking about some of the 3D gimmicks, and since we've talked about a lot of these films already, we've seen the spectrum, the ones that are in your face, and the very subtle ones where you and I are literally like, was this in 3D? This one was kind of in that in-between. The dart thing with the sheriff, super obvious. A few guns pointed at the screen. But besides that, I don't know if this would be more enjoyable in 3D, but it certainly didn't feel like in-your-face 3D.
Yeah, similar to Coming at Ya, I started to keep a track of like the 3D shots that I could see. And yeah, you named most of them. You would watch this movie and would not really guess that this was a 3D release. At the very beginning, in like the opening military scene, like the guy extends his like pointer and like sticks it at the camera. I was like, oh.
I do remember that.
Like one of the first scenes. So I started cracking up. I'm like, oh, this is going to be one of those movies. Then there's like hardly anything. Like the dart thing was funny. That reminded me very much of Coming at Ya. Yeah, the couple of rifles pointing at the screen. One guy throws some tenting equipment at the screen.
There's a guy who's those townspeople who are packing up feverishly. They throw stuff into the trunk, and there's like one shot where something is kind of thrown at the screen, but
they're like tent poles or something like that. Yeah.
But when you think about like the dart, okay, but like just packing, like that's your 3D shot, like that kind of gives you a bit of the tone. There's the one part where the girl, she's found bleeding and blood is dripping in the tub, and I thought if that scene wasn't in 3D. That was disappointing because you feel like that shot with her fingers in the foreground. But again, not super obvious. I'm just hoping it was in 3D.
Right. And there was another shot with the gas station guy, again, friend of the sheriff. Like you meet him, like you're saying, like might as well just have like a bell going off over his head when he's introduced. Like here's another future victim.
That's right.
And they towards the end, they go back to the gas station and he's laying there. He has a knife because he definitely tried to defend himself, but he's laying there again, knife in the foreground, blood dripping off it. I'm like, okay, so there's another 3D shot. And I think other than the fight with the sheriff and the government guy towards the end when they fall into the pool, that's the only other one that I really remember being like, yes, here's the deliberate attempt to have something come out of from the screen.
And that becomes part of the conversation we talk about these movies, especially when we haven't seen them before. If it's not a very obvious 3D movie, like Metal Storm, The Destruction of Jared-Sin, and we kind of talked about that on that episode where it seems like that was done after the fact. And Charles Band got some money to kind of retrofit it. So in some ways, I don't want to say it makes sense, but I think to probably enjoy that movie the way it was intended, you really do probably need to watch it in 3D.
Yes.
I would like to hope that Rottweiler's in that category because on its own, without the 3D added to it, it's a little lackluster. I hope like what Austin said when we were talking about Treasure of Four Crowns, you can watch Treasure of Four Crowns on its own, but to have a turkey vulture thrown at you, it's you got to have the 3D glasses on, which means, you have to, go through the investment of maybe buying like a re-release where they've done a proper job. I think this does not get the Vinegar Syndrome, Scream Factory, Shout Factory treatment.
Yeah, it's not very well lit. And again, I don't fault, because this was, low budget, legitimately a lot of scenes shot at night. I think that robs it of some of that depth that you might have gotten seeing it in 3D. But, there's no Rottweilers jumping at the screen. There's no Rottweilers jumping through windows like at you or anything like that. That I would think, like, if you were trying to do it over the top and your name is Rottweiler, you would have at least one of those, like, just like obligatory scenes to be like, and here it is, because that's the name of the film and it's in 3D. So here's a Rottweiler coming out at you. None of that stuff. It really almost just plays as a straight horror movie. I mean, there's some kind of comic relief stuff by a couple of characters, but it's not tongue in cheek at all. Like, this is stoic, very serious. Earl Owensby, almost reversed his name there, is, does not have a ton of charisma, but super interesting guy, as we both recently found out. But
he might be more interesting than the movie, as people may already be hearing. We move on from Rottweiler to him. But no, 100%. The thing you said about the horror movies, it leans into the tropes, I think, of all the slasher movies that have kind of taught us how to watch some of these movies. There's the scene where the Rottweiler is hiding, presumably quietly, in the backseat of a car. Suddenly jump out.
It was happening, and I still laughed out loud when, 15 minutes later, it finally attacked the guy the doctor as he's driving.
It's just like, it's the scene, right? Michael Myers in the garage, hiding in the bag, pulls out the hanger. It's like, it's this, but with a Rottweiler, or the girls in the tent that are silhouetted. And it was like, okay, all right, somebody showed up on that day to do some lighting.
You're spotted. That is like super slasher trope there. I thought that scene was one of the many disappointing scenes in the movie, because I felt there was a lot that they could have done with that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not like a super short scene, and I'm not saying that it needed to go on a ton longer, but there's a bunch of kills off screen.
Yes.
They set up the whole thing. Really just an excuse to kill a bunch of people in this movie. There's like a photo shoot. It's a bunch of female models, and you've got like the sleazy photographer that's just sitting there like snapping away and not really saying anything too creepy, but still, total 80s sleazy photographer guy. The weird thing is that they're posing in front of tents at night again, but it's supposed to be a shoot to talk about the beauty of the lake area, the lake lure. It's like, you can't see anything, especially with the thing lit. But there's this opportunity to like have this like sleazy photographer, get his when the Rottweilers attack, and he's completely killed off screen. Like you get like the slow pan of like the aftermath where he's like, the camera is firing away because his hand is like, rigor mortis is like clamped on like on the shutter, and he's bleeding. But again, like a couple of scenes, like a real wasted opportunity for something that was kind of set up to be like, this could be like a fun, kind of gory 2 or 3 minute scene. Instead, it's just kind of done and we move on.
I think that's the consistent theme of the movie, is that we only ever get to see the aftermath. There is a place where the Rottweiler is kind of stalking the one woman after the guy drops her off at her house. And you're like, okay, I'm in slasher mode. We're in the slasher's POV. And I get it. Like the second that she disrobes and goes into the shower, that's when she's going to be at her, most vulnerable. That's when the Rottweilers it's like, I get it. Like, I totally see what they're doing. This all makes sense. But then, boom, done. It's just like freeze frame cuts to the Scream Queen, who's now getting killed off screen. And all we get to see is the aftermath. That's what I think robs the movie of maybe being something else, is that all the kills, it's like, it's kind of non-threatening, because you see the barking, you see the dog silhouettes, you see the carnage in the aftermath, but you never feel like the aggression of the dogs. Like you could tell they were maybe shot in the woods. Maybe they were given something to make them slobber a little bit, but that's it. We aren't given the bad puppet hand of like someone off screen biting in with some quick cuts and some, red dye. Maybe that would have been enough to be like, wow, we saw the people and the sleazy guy and we saw them get their comeuppance, right? In this, it's just like, you hear the dog bark, and then next shot is, look what the dogs did. And I think that's what was missing, that in between. It's like, well, we kind of need to see a few slashes, a few bites or something.
Yeah, I totally agree. Because you can go the route of Jaws, which is like we don't need to go into again why Jaws was so effective, but you can go that route and not show either the dogs or not show every single frame of an attack. But what this movie does is it basically builds up, like you're saying, like it builds up everything that you've come to expect from a slasher. And then right when the action hits, it just cuts away. And then it's a sharp cut to the aftermath. It kind of cheats the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And this was probably a budget decision on some level. Maybe they didn't want it to be too gory. There's a fair amount of blood in this, but I understand the reasoning by that. But again, I feel it just really cheats the audience out of, what they build up to and then what comes after.
That's a good point you mentioned, because like there's the purpose of the film. I mean, come on, Dogs of War. Like there's a certain built-in premise there that when you see it on screen is restrained. And that's a good point that you brought up, because like you would think this could be gorier or could be bloodier, but it's not. If you told me this was a TV movie that was released, I would be like, okay, I could see that. And I think that's where we never really go beat by beat through these movies. So if you're listening to this, like, we don't want to rob you of the of the opportunity you have of watching Rottweiler on your own. But I think that's where the movie in some cases was not disappointing to me, Pete, but also not as good as I was hoping it would be.
Yes. And there's moments, I mean, there are a couple of unintentional comedy moments that I laughed at. I mean, we can talk about the underground bar that's owned by the couple.
Gotta love that.
That for whatever reason, again, like early 80s, but the middle of the bar, there's a there's a mud wrestling ring that features prominently throughout. Like there's only one scene where there's actually mud wrestling taking place, but because this was clearly shot in an actual establishment, like the camera is constantly panning through all the all the people sitting at their tables drinking.
All six of them that are just moved around.
Yeah. And then it has to pan past the mud wrestling ring. And I was just kept like, this is like so 70s. Like it's reminding me of like this thing needed like wood paneled basement or something like that.
That's what it looked like. Everyone is like a caricature. There's the mud wrestling thing. You get the doctor with like the perpetual smoking pipe. Like I don't think he talks much without that pipe being in his mouth. Everyone is kind of like reduced to the caricature. And in some ways, like if you're going to be a caricature, you guys almost have a little bit of you can kind of have fun with it. Like you can be a little ridiculous, but because it's restrained even on some of those levels, I wish this was almost in some ways a bit more cartoony. So when you see like the mud wrestling, it's like, okay, good. Movie now knows what it is. Like, all right, let's get into it. And then it kind of pulls back. It's like, no. You guys just told us, quote, and yes, I do have this quoted, Pete. The dogs have developed a malevolent presence. They seemed evil and lost their human affection response. At that point, I'm like, guys, let it ride. Let these dogs be whatever you want them to be. Just make it entertaining. Make it fun.
Yeah. The big scene that I thought really was a lost opportunity was getting, I don't even know if it was towards the end, maybe like right around the third act. There's a big party going on the lake at night. The sheriff's son is there. There's like conflict between them for some reason that's never really explained. Like
we've had all this time, but that's never explained.
Like the sheriff's son is the most miserable prick, and he has no reason to be. Like his life seems pretty good. He's got a girlfriend that is very much adoring of him, and he's like rebel without a cause, but more like rebel without a clue. He's like it's crazy. But anyway, he's at the lake, and so the sheriff's like, I got to go to the lake because Billy's there. I got to warn them kids. And so he shows up. He's like, son, let's go for a walk. And you think they're going to have like the big heart-to-heart talk. No, they don't. The next scene cuts to them. They're like back, amongst the party goers. And all of a sudden you see this boat coming towards shore.
For a very long time.
And you know it's the deputy because he's been riding around the lake on this thing. And he has met a grisly end. And the whole time that this boat is coming towards shore, I'm like, please tell me that the Rottweilers are driving this boat. That would be so fun.
See, the cartooniness, that's it. That might have saved the movie a little bit, 100%.
But no, they were not.
They kill him on the boat. His hand is like on the pedal and that thing is just going. And those dogs hit the beach and they like fly out into the crowd and just like jaws open and just go wild. That's what this movie should have been. I think that would have been the movie I wanted to watch. Yes.
Yeah. If that scene happened, this movie is way better known than it is now.
Dogs torpedoing through the air into the masses, like boom. Dog torpedoes. How often do you get to say that phrase? Very few times. That would have been a cool one. The ending though, when the place was set on fire, was, I thought, interesting because again, they have these dogs that have trapped some of these people, they're trying to get them out. And then towards the end, when the trope, right? The boogeyman, the villain, the slasher has been trapped inside this burning inferno, no seemingly, way they can survive. Okay. I kind of get it. But also the shots you have of these dogs have now made me legitimately worried about their well-being. So there were a few times where I'm like, you guys went from evil attack dogs to that was not the shot to show us, because that looks like a scared dog, and it doesn't feel like you have enough budget to have PETA or anyone else looking for their well-being. But I'm going to hope Earl Owensby, being the owner of these dogs, would not have let harm come to them. I hope.
Yeah. And you're never sure, like, how many dogs are we dealing with here? There's usually like 2 at a time on screen running around. And first of all, Earl Owensby is carrying a revolver or pistol in this movie that, like, literally the holster is like down to his ankle, like his entire pant leg. I've never seen anything like. I've never seen anyone try to overcompensate for something before in quite that way. And so he's blowing away like several dogs. A couple of other ones get killed by a couple of the other townspeople. So you're never quite sure, like, are there 2 left or there's 1 left? I don't really know. And yeah, that last scene at the resort, whatever you want to call it, that a bunch of people are trapped in, goes on way too long. It's a little anticlimactic. The government guy who has been trying to save the dogs the whole time, because all of a sudden he pulls out like this little box with a red button on it that he can now control. They still will listen to him, but like no one else is hearing it. They don't. The dogs, they just need to be shot, and that's all that the sheriff cares about. And so he gets into it with the government guy because he's like, you got to save the dogs, and they get into this protracted fight. They end up in the pool. They actually wasted or used underwater camera to get like scenes of them fighting underwater. I was really confused at one point when the sheriff stabs the government guy, because I thought it was the other way around. I'm like, holy cow, they actually
I was a little unsure who was walking out of that pool, and there was a part of me that was hoping that all of our problems just get solved and no one gets out. Like, all right, the Rottweilers actually win in this movie. It's like, that's nice.
Although it did lead again to one of my other laugh out loud moments when the dogs are coming to this place. The sheriff's got his son and tells his son, go out to the truck to get the flashlight or the lantern or whatever. He does. The dogs are like running up from camera point of view, chasing him to the door. He doesn't realize it. He shuts the door in the dog's face. You have a couple of other scenes, and then it comes back to like the mayor and his buddy, who look like they're brothers. They look very similar. Like I could not tell the two of them apart. But again, nod to Jaws. You've got like the mayor who's trying to do like the economic development of the lake.
And the buddy who's like, well, I said I might invest, but I didn't say I would 100% sure. And meanwhile, they both look like Larry from Three's Company.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah,
yes.
They're on their way to the Regal Beagle.
Yes.
So you've got, like, people are dying. The sheriff is there. He's like, we have an emergency. And these two are like, hey, let's go to the dam where the power, because the power gets cut. Let's go to the dam.
Again, another great horror movie trope, right?
Yeah, power's out. These two knuckleheads start talking real estate deals again in the midst of like a very tense situation. They're kind of like, well, I don't know. I'm going to need a lot more land. And he's like, well, I just so happen to own property on either side. Great. And then they open the front door. The Rottweilers are still there. They just leap on them and attack both these guys and kill them. When that happened, I fucking lost it. I was laughing so hard at that scene. I was like, I can't believe, one, that they pulled that off. Two, that the dogs waited so patiently by the front door the entire time, waiting for someone else to open it. But there they were, and they killed those two.
And be honest, in that moment, you were kind of rooting for the dogs.
I was absolutely rooting for the dogs.
Hey, I'll say this. I'm glad that we got a chance to watch this movie, because
yes,
it is rare that, being children of the 80s that have had the opportunity to watch a lot of these movies that have kind of shaped our DNA, our pop culture, it is rare when we can find a movie that both you and I have said, I have never watched this or even heard of this. So I can't give it like a wholehearted recommendation for someone that hasn't seen it. It's certainly not bad, but it's not like you're watching it for the 3D gimmicks. It's not like it does something interesting. It's just another one of those animal run amok movies, but there are others that are better in this category that do better what Dogs of War, aka Rottweiler, tried to do.
Yeah, and I would say it's worth a watch. I don't know if we'll be revisiting this one often or at all, but yeah, like you, I'm glad that I saw it. I think if you are of a certain type, if you're a horror completist, sure, give it a go. If you like horror from a certain era, like early 80s, I think there's enough there that is interesting. Again, like it's shot on a low budget, so it's kind of got that gritty feel a little bit. that I think got lost as the 80s went on and as the slasher genre really took off. Like I think we've discussed this before, but like if you look at, you go from Friday the 13th, part 3, even part 4, which has a little more of a sheen. And then when you get to part 5, which is a little down and dirty, but when you get to part 6, there's a definite gloss over the way that film looks than from earlier in the series. This is a type of movie that if you like your early Friday the 13th movies and movies from that genre, you might find something in here that you'll enjoy. Again, it's not great. The acting is, no one of a name in this. These people are doing the best that they can. I have to feel that most of them had limited acting experience, and it shows.
Some of them may have been legitimate mayors and or owners of a bar.
Yes, it's entirely possible.
Yes.
Like the bar owner that tries to karate chop the Rottweiler before.
Oh my God! Yes,
cut.
Gotta love it.
That was a choice. That was an acting choice, and I give him all the credit in the world.
I appreciated that.
Remember, you can find the Fan2Fan Podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan2Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN.
On Instagram at Fan2Fan Podcast.
Or on Twitter at Fan2Fan Podcast.
We'd love to hear from you, so send a message and let us know what you think of the show. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
The one thing we did learn from watching this movie, Pete, get to discover a new name, Earl Owensby.
Owensby, yeah.
Running into Rottweiler, okay. Learning about Earl Owensby, I think that's the gift that has continued to keep on giving. Because I don't know if I should apologize. I sent Pete a just about hour and a half documentary on Earl Owensby, the man, the myth, available on YouTube. When you find out about him and you get more context about this man, the movies he's made, his place in the conversation with like Charles Band and Corman, Larry Cohen, Charles B. Pierce type, but very regional. But it seems like none of his movies, from the titles I saw, they never got into cult classic category. It seems like they were very much regional, grindhouse, drive-through, but not movies that we would have run into at the video store or would have watched like late night. His movies never seem to kind of get out of like Southwest drive-in circuits.
Yeah, it reminded me. Yeah, and thank you for sending me that link because I wasn't planning on listening to the whole thing, but after a couple of minutes, I was in. I mean, super interesting guy. It reminded me a bit of like the early days of professional wrestling where there were like territories. Like this guy.
Oh, good call. Yeah.
North Carolina film industry like covered. Like he was doing his thing down there. He made quite a bit of money making his movies. I think he starred in like over 35 films. Like one was like a kind of a knockoff of Walking Tall called Challenge, I think.
Frank Challenge. That was the one. So that came out in like 73.
I saw Walking Tall. People say Gone with the Wind influenced me. Gone with the Wind didn't influence me at all. Walking Tall influenced me. Because Walking Tall was made over in McMinnville, Tennessee for about $1,300,000 with Joe Don Baker playing Buford Purser, and the sucker did about $40 million. Now, $40 million back then was a whole lot of money. We wasn't into these $100 million mega blockbusters at that time. And I said, that's the kind of film I need to do.
And then certainly a product of its time when you think about like Billy Jack and fighting the man and the one lone person against corruption and trying to get revenge. From what I saw in the trailer for Challenge, and then he ends up making a sequel, I think called Manhunter. Joe Don Baker, like Owensby, like not that far off in the group picture from each other in tone and in look.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, again, like, I think you and I are both fairly well schooled in a lot of different genres and a lot of different history of film. We've been schooled ourselves. Nick Dyack comes to mind, schooling us on Italian cinema. By no means are we completists or are we, historians of all this stuff, but we've seen a lot of movies. And again, like to discover someone that had and created like this really successful niche and area of the country in the 70s and 80s is really fascinating. I'm not going to recommend everyone listen to the whole hour and 30-minute documentary because your mileage may vary on whether you find this guy interesting at all. But
it does. It definitely does.
There's a point where it's like, the voiceover is like, and then Earl Owensby purchased an unused nuclear power plant. And it's just like, what? And to round this into something that listeners will understand, this power plant shell was used as a site for the underwater scenes for The Abyss. And I don't remember exactly how he got involved in making that. I think he even got sued for something with the making of that. But like, he dipped his toe into major productions, but he also was very much...
I see what you did there.
a Hollywood outsider, and seemed to want to do it that way because I think he had a lot more control over making the movies that he wanted to make. And he was all about, let's just use local people. We'll keep it local to North Carolina, make the movies that we want to make. We can churn and burn these things really quick. We'll film for 2 weeks. I'll edit it in my basement. We'll get it out.
Right, yeah.
And we can get this on the circuit and make a nice, tidy profit without, having to do a ton of extra work and have to play the Hollywood game.
Earl has proven that a person doesn't have to live in the entertainment capitals, Los Angeles or New York, or even have his movies shown there to be successful in the film business. Some in the industry refer to his films as regional pictures, which is not exactly high praise. Some go so far to call them Billy flicks, redneck shoot-'em-ups, or grit westerns. But Earl himself calls them tasteful grassroots entertainment.
I give this guy a ton of credit, sound like a super interesting guy. And heretofore had never even heard of the name.
Mm-hmm. It's you mentioned if you end up watching this YouTube documentary, Pete said it best. If this was not commissioned by Earl Owensby, I think we would both be surprised because it was very complimentary 90% of the time. And even if its criticism seemed to pull a few punches. So I think that's something kind of the disclaimer that goes with it. But you almost like everything you were saying, Pete, like the fact that the success comes from never spending $1 million to make a film and never signing a distribution deal that would net him less than $8 million.
Let's have no question about it. Earl went into the motion picture industry because it had been a love of his from the very beginning. But he did it principally as a financial venture. And as Earl says, economics is easy. You don't spend as much as you take in. And he was able to do that and build a very successful studio.
I think for an industry, right, in Hollywood, where there's a lot of glitz and glamour, it seems like this guy was very pragmatic in his filmmaking and looking at it from a very economical sense. If I cast myself instead of Burt Reynolds as the main character, I get to save a lot of money, and probably, to be fair to him, he probably gets to dictate the pace of the production, the editing, save certainly a lot of money, but a lot of time, which allows him to then make other films. And because Challenge does so well, where you get a movie like Billy Jack in 71, and then you get Walking Tall. Got to check my notes here. I do not immediately know off the top of my head when Walking Tall came out. 73.
Early 70s, yeah.
So those are early 70s. And then he's smart enough to release a Challenge in 73 as well. Because then if the theater is packed with people watching Walking Tall, they walk out. What would they like to do? Either watch Walking Tall again, watch the sequel. And if the sequel's not ready, they'll watch Challenge. And, to take advantage of that, very smart. I mean, you could say it's, him just taking advantage of the trend, just like Rottweiler that we talked about, like the 3D trend, Animals Amok trend. But hearing about this guy, what he was able to do, the movies that he did, throwing out names out there, The Brass Ring, Dark Sunday, Death Driver, Chain Gang, Tales of the Third Dimension. I think you would agree, Pete. I have not heard of any of these films at all.
Not one.
Not one. And that, in our continued exercise in going through these 3D movies, that he produces 6 3D movies.
I saw that. My heart almost sank. I'm like, shit, we got to watch these things.
I was like, whoa. Like, okay, Rottweiler in 83, something called Hot Air 1984, which again just sounds like a Three Stooges sketch. Chain Gang in 1984, where he, surprise, surprise, Earl Owensby stars as like a bounty hunter that's imprisoned for the wrong reasons and then fight against the very people he put in prison when he's put in a chain gang. I'm like, okay, that's fair.
It ain't so, Earl.
Hyperspace, aka Gremloids, that has like Paula Poundstone in it. And we kind of mentioned that a few times. Not that either one have seen it, but that was in 84. Hit the Road Running in 87. Tales of the Third Dimension in 84. So dude goes out there and buys this equipment, figures out how to do the 3D thing. And I guess maybe that's another good business decision. I've got the equipment. I'm not going to just use it once. I might as well use it until I can't use it anymore. Then it's 84. I don't know what year Jaws 3D came out, but we've kind of heard from stories like Jaws 3D was kind of the nail in the coffin for this trend.
He says it in the documentary.
That's right. That's
kind of pissed.
Three-dimensional pictures was an idea that had come of age, and Earl began production on the first 3D movie shot in the United States in 25 years. And even though his version was an updated technique and a great improvement over the old 1950s method, this was one of the few times that Owensby didn't face things realistically. This was one time when Earl Owensby's golden touch didn't even bring in silver. Other studios caught the bandwagon and began flooding the market with 3D releases like Friday the 13th in 3D and Amityville 3D.
All these things hit, and the one that really killed it was Jaws 3 in 3D. Terrible movie. Technically terrible. And they just went out en masse with it, 1,500, 2,000 prints. You can't do that on 3D. And I blame that is one thing that happened. The other thing that happened is they go into multiplexes and 3D has to be tweaked. The projectionist has to make sure that the frame is where the frame is supposed to be. If you don't have 3D. Your convergence is off. They wouldn't do that.
It's like if it wasn't for Jaws 3D being a bad movie, and then also, the technical piece of having to have projectionists try to align the picture to take advantage of, the thing in the title, the 3D piece. Who knows? This guy could have had a dozen 3D films, but my God, even Charles Band doesn't have 6 3D films, but Earl Owensby does. So yeah, when I think of that picture, Cohen, Band, Charles B. Pierce, Corman, I have to now start thinking Owensby is part of that group picture.
Yeah, without a doubt. I did find it funny when one of his friends in the documentary was like, if he played the game, he could have been Burt Reynolds. I'm like,
probably not. Yeah, and the fact that he plays Elvis and actually seems to sing and brings in Ray Orbison, Western legends to kind of be part of his productions. He had his roots in that outsider industry that you mentioned. But ultimately, again, he didn't have to sell as many tickets as a Burt Reynolds would because he could get away with making a smaller movie at a smaller budget and still making a profit.
Yeah. Again, for where he was in the Carolinas, he had that region where there was a following. There was an audience for the type of movies that you and I and maybe most people never heard of, but clearly he was able to make a career out of it.
But let's remember, when I went in the movie business, I had only one place to go with my movie, and that was to either the theaters or the drive-ins, or I didn't go. I mean, there was no video, there was no cable, there was no place like Home Box Office, Showtime, there was no pay-per-view. None of that stuff exists. And so to roll those dice and get into that business at that time, I think, and build a studio in Shelby, North Carolina, would probably have been a $1 million to 1 shot at least, yeah.
Earl Owensby will tell you in no uncertain terms that he knows where he came from, he knows where he's been, and probably where he's going. And if you cross him, he may well tell you where you can go.
He wasn't a filmmaker by trade. I forget, he came out of the Army and was doing sales or something like that, ran for office, lost an election, and then was just kind of like, I think I'm just going to make a movie, and did. I had no idea how to do it, and just, went and churned out a bunch of stuff. So again, a self-made man from that standpoint.
When you get through his history, he was basically given up as an infant, and his mother committing suicide, finding out his father was dead. There certainly seems to be a lot of tragedy in his early years, coming from a place of poverty and class issues. And it seems like there was a lot of stuff going on in his life, but certainly have made a name for himself, a legacy. In that documentary, they talk about, people like Tarantino and Spielberg being aware of him.
All right. Well, this is a good-looking cover. A freakish army experiment out of control terrorizes a resort town. An idyllic resort community has been ravaged by an unimaginable terror. Horribly mangled bodies are littering the countryside. The ensuing gruesome investigation leads a puzzled sheriff to the local university and to a fantastic, terrible secret. It seems the killers are a renegade horde of Rottweilers. Oh, if you don't know it by then, I don't think you're going to get this one.
Okay. There's quite a few killer dog movies, all right? But I'm going to say it's the Earl Owensby film Rottweiler.
Take a look. It is
Dogs of Hell. Let me see that one for a second.
Yeah, you can have that.
Now, who directed this? I'm right.
Nobody directed it.
Earl Owensby.
Oh, that was
the original title. The original title was called Rottweiler. That's the cheapy video title.
Look at that. Let's zoom in on that. There you go. Earl Owensby. It was originally, called
Rottweiler in 3D.
Unbelievable.
It feels like a Tarantino or Spielberg would know who this guy is because they would have heard of his movies or his legacy. So maybe I'm done from not having heard of this guy before. But if you haven't, then welcome to the club. Maybe watch some of this documentary and you'll be as impressed as Pete and I were.
Yeah. So again, like Rottweiler, the movie, not that great, but we were still able to find some interesting things that came out of this that we did not know before. So, I feel more enriched that we've seen it now.
Another 3D movie off our list that wasn't even on our list, and an hour and a half documentary off on our list. So our YouTube watching history is getting quite interesting, Pete.
Yeah. And before we go, again, one of the most entertaining things about this movie, again, because it was shot in the Carolinas with a local crew, some of the best names you're going to find in the credits. And I'll just leave you with two.
Love it.
You can discover the rest. But this movie was directed by Worth Keeter. Feel ashamed for your given birth name now after hearing that. And this one made me laugh. The dolly grip, none other than Gene Pool.
That's how we end. Gotta love Rottweiler.